Okay, at this point in the talk, I want to focus on the three institutions that are fundamental for international law. And those are the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and the International Criminal Court. And I want to go in the order that they were created. That is, the ICJ in 1945, the International Criminal Tribunal comes into existence in the 1990s on the heels of the war in the former Yugoslavia from 1992 to 1995. And then the last one, the International Criminal Court, is created with the Treaty of Rome in 1998. Okay, so let me deal with each of these institutions, beginning with the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice, it's important to point out, was established in 1945. And it's authorized by the United Nations. It's authorized by the UN Charter. It's authorized by the UN General Assembly and by the Security Council. The International Court of Justice deals with relations between states. This is important because we're going to look at the International Criminal Court later on. And the International Criminal Court, in fact, is trying to try and convict individuals, political leaders and military leaders responsible for the most egregious violations of human rights. So the ICJ, or the International Court of Justice, deals with relations between states. As pointed out before, it's based in The Hague in the Peace Palace. And the aim, essentially, is to settle disputes between states. But in fact, the states themselves that are a party to the disputes can completely ignore the findings. There's nothing binding about the decisions of the judges in the ICJ. 193 states have signed on, and let me give you two interesting cases that have taken place, and then a third one that's a controversial case. The first was a border dispute between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Again, the decision of the court was not binding on neither Ethiopia or Eritrea, but essentially it's a suggestion to those two states for peacefully arbitrating their conflict, their border conflict. The other was, in fact, a case that was put by Yugoslavia against NATO for its 79-day bombardment of Yugoslavia in the context of what NATO said was ethnic cleansing that was going on, directed mostly at the Muslim Kosovar Albanians. And a third case, a controversial case, which the United States of America completely ignored, was in the early 1980s when the ICJ actually said that the United States of America was engaging in international terrorism by sponsoring the Contras, which is an armed group, an armed anti-communist group that was trying to advance U.S. interests in the context of the Cold War in Nicaragua by trying to overthrow the communist Sandinista government. Okay, so this is the International Court of Justice. Let's now move on to the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. This court is, in fact, an ad hoc court, very much like the Nuremberg trials and the Tokyo trials that I mentioned in 1946 and 1954. And it comes as a result of a horrendous civil war with the disintegration of Yugoslavia from 1992 to 1995. And the aim of the court is to examine the crimes of the participants in that war, largely Serbs, Croats, and Bosnian Muslims. Slobodan Milosevic, the former leader of Yugoslavia, in fact, was tried by this court. He never recognized its jurisdiction, saying that it is a court that has been sanctioned by the UN Security Council, which is true, and not the General Assembly, and hence it doesn't have international legitimacy. Milosevic, in fact, died before the ending of the trial, but the figure of Slobodan Milosevic, a major European leader, confronting the international community with egregious human rights violations, was a sight that was impressive, that galvanized international attention, and was a demonstration effect, in my estimation, for all world leaders. If you're going to systematically violate human rights, you're going to have to account for it. By the way, the court is still going on. Its cases are still being held, and it's estimated that those will end around 2014, 2015. The Serbs have claimed that the court is not an impartial court. They say 70% of the convictions have been for Serbs. Let's now move on to what, in my estimation, is the most important development in international law in recent years, that is the creation of the International Criminal Court in 1998. It's important to point out here that the ambit of the International Criminal Court is 3 crimes: genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, and potentially a 4th one in the future, the crime of aggression. The ICC only looks at crimes committed after 2000, and the court, in fact, came into force in 2002. 122 states have signed on. 8 situations have been looked at, all in Africa. The most famous ones in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, and Libya. The most famous person indicted is a sitting head of state, that is Omar al-Bashir, seen as responsible for the genocide in Darfur that began in 2003. The important thing to point out about the International Criminal Court is that it doesn't punish states. It punishes individuals, political leaders, military leaders that are seen as responsible for genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. I should also point out that non-state actors can also be indicted. A good example of this is Joseph Kony's Lord Resistance Army, and that is one of the situations that the ICC has looked at. The first conviction was, in fact, took place in 2013, that is this year, in the Lubanga case, that is from the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the accused was convicted of 14 years in prison. Again, just like with Milosevic on trial, the sight of these world leaders, of soldiers, of guerrilla army leaders behind bars, I think, is impressive for the entire international community. It is something that would have been unthinkable in another period in history. Finally, I should point out that the ICC works on the principle of complementarity. That is, that states have the first obligation to look into crimes committed on their territory, that is, these great crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. If they are unable or unwilling, this is where the International Criminal Court steps in. Again, there is no international police force or military force that in fact is going to enforce this. This is what I talked about earlier with Hobbes's quotation, covenants without swords are but empty words. But nonetheless, we have 30 people indicted so far, and lots of people behind bars, and as I mentioned, 8 situations. So somehow some of these people responsible for these egregious human rights violations are ending up in The Hague. So in conclusion, I'd like to say that the International Criminal Court, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and the International Court of Justice are part of what is called international law, but the main differences is that the ICC is a permanent court, the ICJ is permanent, but the ICJ deals with states, relations between states. The ICC, in fact, is looking to try individuals for egregious human rights violations. And the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia is, in fact, an ad hoc court that, once all the cases are heard, in fact, will no longer exist.